Okay, I'm not quite seeing the numbers we were expecting, so I'll leave it another 30 seconds before getting going, but thank you for everyone who's here so far. Okay, let's get going. Like I've said already, thank you everybody who's taken the time today to participate in what is the first of the TRIC webinar series for 2020. We are hoping to continue this webinar series on into 2021, and I thank you all for coming. So I'd like to start by acknowledging and paying my respects to the First Nations on whose lands we meet. Here in Canberra, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people and the Ngambri people and their elders past, present and emerging. Our speaker today, Michael, is coming from Austin, Texas, where the First Nations include the Tonkawa, the comanche and the Lipan Apaches. It is with great pleasure that I introduce you all to Professor Michael Johnston. Michael is a Charles A. Dana Professor of Political Science at Colgate University. He earned his PhD from Yale in 1977 and has authored and edited numerous academic works on corruption and how to prevent it. His work has also included influential reports for the World Bank, USAID, and other practitioners in the field. It's been a little over 12 months since Michael was here with us in Canberra, and for a retired academic, he has not remained still at all. His latest chapter, Anti-Corruption and its Discontents, Reforming Reform, has just been published in this lovely volume I have here, edited by Adam Graycar. Today, Michael will be considering where we're heading in our combined efforts at fighting corruption and reflecting on what anti-corruption will look like in a generation's time. I'll now hand over to Michael and look forward to hearing him speak on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for joining in. I am delighted to be with you even in this respect. My visit last year was, along with my wife, it was our first visit to Australia, and it was really legitimately a thrill to be there. And I was so happy to be able to talk to several groups in several places. And as usual, I took a great deal more back with me than I brought to the table. But I'll also second Adam's acknowledgement of our First Nations. The land where my house sits is former Comanche territory, and then by the usual sad historical process became ranch land and is now a suburb. But it's so important to keep that history very much in mind. Greetings from the United States, where we are paying in a variety of ways for a variety of sins, historical, social, environmental, and the like, and where we are not surprisingly very concerned about corruption in a number of ways at all of our levels of government. What we'll do in this session is what I'll do is less offer any great insights on what is to be done, but more to speculate on where the current trends in reform might take us, where the current trends in corruption itself and global influences might take us. Because as I mentioned in one of my slides, the law of unintended consequences is probably the most important thing for reformers to keep in mind. What we want to do, what we think will work, often turns out to do very different kinds of things, and there are other kinds of influences that we find it hard to factor into our thinking. Perhaps this conversation, and I'm very much looking forward to your feedback, perhaps this conversation will stir some useful thoughts about where the future might leave us. So let me put this up on the screen and Start from the beginning, I hope, please. There we go. Let's go back. You know, what will we see in 2050? The 30-year interval is picked more or less arbitrarily, although if we wanted to talk about the origins of the modern anti-corruption movement now in industry, the late 80s, 1990 makes as good a time as any to to date what we're doing. So you have another, we have another 30 years to think about where we are headed. The movement itself, which is in many respects now an industry, and in some respects the growth has been very fortunate, has maybe in other respects not been, has involved a lot of effort, a lot of resources, tremendous analytical progress, a tremendous growth just in the level of interest in corruption. The book that I have coming out sometime around the end of this year with a good friend, Scott Fritzen, begins with a short letter I received from the American Political Science Association back in the late 1980s, saying, in effect, "Dear Professor Johnston, thank you for proposing a session on corruption. However, we are only going to discuss important theoretical issues. Corruption doesn't qualify, so thanks, but no thanks." That sort of thing doesn't happen anymore, and that's a good thing. The movement has grown. It has gained resources, adherence, a kind of legitimacy, so that any of us who were concerned that corruption would be the flavor of the month for maybe a few months or a few years have been gratified in seeing how the issue is now solidly on the international agenda. And that in itself, as my anecdote suggests, that's an accomplishment, that's an achievement, and it's one that is not to be denigrated. At the same time, it's hard to deny that our results in trying to fight corruption have been indifferent at best, and in some cases counterproductive. And I think if you want an overview of where we stand globally in all of those terms, you could do far worse than to pick up Adam's new book, his new anthology, the one that Adam Masters was kind enough to mention, and you get a very, very good sort of broad-gauged synopsis of what we are trying to do, what we've accomplished, what we have failed to do, where we might be headed. So I really commend that book to you. There is in the anti-corruption industry some reassessment going on. Some groups that did not take to criticism kindly even just a few years ago are now doing some soul searching. There are, of course, new circumstances emerging, and just the rise of populism, just the rise of various kinds of international business that is very hard to pin down to any one location. Those are circumstances that are emerging and that are changing very, very rapidly. We need to adapt what we're doing. We need to rethink, but with what results? What do we seek? What's it all about? What's the goal of fighting corruption? I think we can agree that a world with no corruption at all is probably not on the cards. So what do we seek? And how would we know what success looks like were we to get there? These would be questions to think about. So we'll take a look at some what we might think of as alternative futures. Corruption itself is rapidly evolving, really changing at warp speed, I would say. In many respects, we are often gearing up to fight the last war. Especially our law enforcement techniques tend to lag well behind that which we hope to police and to regulate. Corruption itself is often embedded in legal processes. I mean, here the work of Lawrence Lessig is very valuable. Dennis Thompson as well, pointing to the ways in which corruption in many instances doesn't so much fight with the law and fight with the formal institutions, but exist within them quite comfortably, and indeed both hurt and harm those institutions in a variety of ways. So another problem we have is measurement. How do we know we're doing any good? How do we know we're not doing harm? Do we know even that we're having any effect at all? And effect on what? Those are, things that we have been working on in one way or another. 25 years after its debut, the TI perception index is still, the most frequently quoted kind of metric that we've got. These are, part of the dilemmas that make it so difficult to both to fight corruption and to claim that we are having any success. There are a lot of obstacles. In political terms, all too often the fight is a fight of the weak against the strong, of the of the many, but the many dispersed, the many deprived, the many divided, against the deeply entrenched, well-connected, powerful interests with a stake in corruption. There's a kind of a political economy logic, too, that makes life very difficult for us. The benefits of corruption are often, as we see on the slide, tangible, concentrated, short-term, large. You have powerful interests with a stake in the corrupt status quo. The costs are quite often widely shared and long-term. Sometimes they are intangible. That doesn't make them any the less real, but they are maybe perhaps for any one person on any given day surprisingly small. Those costs are immense, and yet they are distributed and they are experienced in ways that make the fight just that much harder. There are collective action problems, especially because we tend all too often to describe the goals of reform in sort of community goods kinds of terms, or kind of collective goods. We're fighting corruption, have better government for everyone. Well, yes, we are. To have a better economy for all. Well, yes, we are. But when we have that sort of shared goal, free rider problems, problems of collective action tend to be all too common, and especially when we take into account that fighting corruption can be risky, it can be dangerous, it can involve a lot of uncertainties and risks. It's all too easy to leave the hard work, to leave the heavy lifting to other people. And of course, in any population, there are some people who stand to make small gains, crumbs from the table, or maybe just they think they do from corruption. I was in Peru a few years ago, and the phrase that I heard over and over translates roughly to, with respect to an official, he steals, but he gives us projects. He robs from us, but at the same time we get a few miles of road or something like that, or maybe not even that much. And so some people find it easier to sort of go with the flow, to, as they used to say in Hong Kong, either get on the bus or run alongside it, rather than to stand in front of it. Now, a lot of our reforms that we have evolved are institutional. They're based on deterrence, they're based on punishment, and those, of course, require sound institutions. Many of them are intended to improve routine processes. Good government is not to be equated with efficiency, because you can imagine easily an agency that efficiently implements disastrous policy. But nonetheless, many of our reforms are aimed at improving, smoothing, ironing out the kinks in various kinds of governmental and administrative processes. But corruption weakens those very institutions. It abuses and takes advantage of, at times hides within, and capitalizes upon those institutions and those processes. Pardon me. We have some smoke in the air from the West Coast here, and I've found my voice is suffering a little bit. Corruption can have causes and effects that are outside the routine, that we just simply can't reach by making a routine process more transparent or less costly, more efficient, and so forth. One big problem, and we point this out in the book that's coming out, is that demand for enforcement is sporadic, it's ineffective, it comes from sources that are divided. It isn't that we don't have good ideas, it isn't that we're not trying good ideas, but many of those good ideas need much more sustained and effective kind of political support. And so the demand for enforcement, especially if we talk about it in terms of public goods, that demand is often ineffective. And our, excuse me, pardon me, our responses to corruption often evolve far more slowly than the problem itself, and often lag behind its change. They're sort of post hoc kinds of changes. So this is just a survey of some of the reasons why our task is a very difficult one. Some of the variables in play, and I think I probably have mentioned some of them already. Surging inequality, for example, that feeds causes and results from corruption in a variety of ways, and that weakens the responses to it. Political responses, such as populism, and I will have more to say about populism a little later on. Technological changes, money can zip around the globe in a nanosecond. The ability now to do business everywhere and not be taxed or regulated anywhere, that's partly a technological kind of thing. The Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, and many others to surface have given us some sense of just how how we are lagging behind the game. One of the issues too, so calling it the rise of compliance. And what I'm questioning here is not that people are working on compliance and that people are teaching compliance and so forth. It's very important. It's a complex world. If you have the standards of ISO 37001 out there and in play, or if you have the United States Federal Corrupt Practices Act, or Sapin-2 in France, that's complicated stuff, and just raising the issue of staying on the good side of the law is a complicated matter. But too often lately we're seeing compliance being used as though it were synonymous with all of corruption. All of corruption control, I should say, synonymous with all of reform. That if we could just get people to follow the rules, in a sense, and that's, people are not saying it in so many words, but often that's the implication. If we could just get people to follow the rules, we'd have the problem licked. I'll talk about some reasons why that is not the case in just a moment. Some of the countervailing forces that we think we can depend upon, independent journalism, for example, is in serious trouble in many countries. In my country, there was an interesting political science study showing that when a city loses one of its newspapers, the bond ratings of its local government tend to deteriorate. And there's an interesting possibility there that just the lack of scrutiny, or the weakening of scrutiny of public accountability, is reducing the quality of government. The politicization of judiciaries, it's happening here, it's happening in many other countries. The fragmentation of civil society along many lines, notably inequality, but many others we could talk about. And of course, there is the law of unintended consequences that's always, more or less always out there. So where might all that lead us? One possibility, and it's maybe one that we would like to see, is civic virtue triumphant. I mean, maybe the day will come that reform will have made many breakthroughs and corruption will be completely the exception, and will be on the way to eradication. That's a fine ideal. But there's very little consensus over what civic virtue is. beyond technocratic and process criteria, very little consensus about what good governance is, and even less about the relationship between good governance on the one hand and good politics on the other. The one involves a convergent set of standards and set of procedures. The other involves a degree of healthy difference and contention over what government ought to be doing. What is the relationship between the two? Historically, the idea of corruption, in fact, has risen out of clashing interests. It's not that people have a flash of insight as to what is good governance in most instances. Instead, it's people objecting to being mistreated. You're not going to take my land any longer. You're not going to abuse my family any longer, and so forth. And beginning the contentious political process of drawing lines and boundaries around what can be done with wealth and power and the ways they can be used and pursued. Often that kind of contention culminates not in civic breakthroughs, not in sort of, brave new worlds of good governance, but often in terms of stalemates, stalemates that can be quite useful if they restrain the abusers of power, and if those stalemates eventually solidify into workable institutions, or at least workable settlements in that historic kind of sense. Pursuing civic virtue just by itself is, again, an example of setting up corruption control as a public good, making it vulnerable to collective action problems. It's a fragile public good at that, threatened by the powerful. One cannot help but think in terms of what we would like to see as civic virtues, but often getting there is a very contentious process with a lot of setbacks and a lot of curves in the road. Reform may require not just virtue, it may require disruption. Disruption of power alignments, informal little networks of power that are more important than large nominal public institutions. It may require disruption of public and private links and connections that are quite beneficial to people who are well positioned, who are given many resources and have a lot of connections. It certainly is more than just a matter of being good, as much as being good is important. As I used to like to tell my students, for almost 71 years now, I have gotten up in the morning and I have promised to be good, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So it's more than civic virtue that seems to be we're after. Data to the rescue, or big data. Now here, I'm firmly convinced there's tremendous potential. If we can look at the bigger picture, if we can begin to spot patterns, if we can begin to spot vulnerabilities, alliances, and so forth, experiment with new and sophisticated proxy measures of corruption or vulnerability that we might never have had even 20 years ago, there's a great deal that we can do. For that, we need something that many reformers don't want to talk about, and that is theory. That is something that academicians and analysts can contribute, just to help us interpret what we see as we sift through all the data. And the big data by themselves will not rescue us. Big data, though, can give us a field within which we can do far more to figure out what it is we want to stop, what it is we want to encourage, what might look like progress, and perhaps where we are headed over time. Transparency is one of those all-purpose terms that we all like. Transparency alone will not save the day either. Somebody has to be looking through the windows we open. Somebody has to be able to put data to use. Bruce Kane has an excellent book on precisely this issue. Transparency, in fact, can aid corrupt actors. There are many instances in American politics where legislation that has a lot of support. Clean air legislation or gun control legislation has been stymied precisely because transparency has allowed powerful contributors to keep their pet legislators in line. The Florida legislature passed a piece of gun control legislation early in 2020, I think it was, by a voice vote, and it would have been a very worthwhile piece of legislation. But then they went to a roll call vote, and the same legislation, the same legislators voted it down. Because with transparency, contributors were, were able to follow up and make sure they were getting value for money in terms of their political spending. So transparency can cut several ways. I think, again, just to reiterate, in the realm of data, big and small, there's tremendous potential. We're just beginning to go down that road, in fact, but simply having data and having transparency alone, those are, maybe some of the means. They are not the ends in and of themselves. Compliance and box checking as a kind of a descent into routine anti-corruption activity. As I've mentioned, just staying on the good side of the law is difficult stuff. What is it that we want to do? What is it that we want to avoid doing? ISO 37001, those standards make fascinating reading, and they are essential, and they are essential piece of the puzzle. But compliance should not be discussed as though it were synonymous with reform and corruption control in general. Many of the compliance standards deal with internal management within firms, within agencies. They are a kind of a defensive set of standards, and thus very valuable for that. But what about the broader dynamics in society that make for corruption, that make reform so difficult? Compliance may turn corruption control into box checking. We did this, we did that, we did the other thing. But the whole question of power imbalances, the question of justice, as mentioned earlier, these have to be taken up in some way other than simply saying, here's a rule, how do we get people to follow it? There is a group in Annapolis, Maryland, here in the United States called TRIC, which is doing compliance, but doing it in a really sophisticated fashion. And they have statistical models. I've seen some of them, and they are mind-bogglingly complex. But statistical models that have some predictive power of what kind of pressure for bribery a company will encounter in a given society, where it will come from, how intense it will be, and so forth. And that's taking the compliance realm and reaching out into the bigger picture. And I think that's a very high potential kind of approach. It begins to verge upon big data as well. So my discussion here is not meant to denigrate the notion of compliance, but rather to say, let's think about compliance, but let's think about a good deal else. The privatization of everything. Well, many of us will remember how in the 80s, the early 90s, maybe even on into the late 90s, privatization, liberalization, that was it. Take the bureaucrat out of the loop, and the bureaucrat won't have any influence to sell, and so forth. But the trouble is that privatization may just shift unjust activities into the private sector, farther away from public scrutiny, may encourage a form of state and agency capture as those agencies become dependent upon private parties to perform basic functions and so forth. We tend to forget that corruption itself can be thought of as a form of privatization, sort of a brute force kind of privatization, as in here, I'll have that, thank you very much. But privatizing is not a panacea. corruption can be a chronic problem in privatization processes. It's one thing to privatize um, a public corporation, an SOE, if you've got a sound stock market, if you've got the rule of law, if you've got a good court system, a good properties law, and so forth. It's another if you have quote unquote auctions for privatization and they're at odd times and odd places, and strangely enough, only one party shows up to bid, which was a chronic story in the former Soviet realm. So privatization is not the be all and end all of corruption control. Without strong institutions that can make corruption worse, Argentina is an interesting case, and under pressure from the United States and other sources in the late 1990s, the Menem governments in Argentina privatized aggressively, cut back on the state, cut back on the public workforce, put tremendous public assets up for sale. They were the privatization poster child, if you will, and as a result, corruption went up. And then came the Kirchners, and they tried in the early 2000s to roll back the wheel somewhat and bring the state back in, and corruption went up. Why is that? There's an excellent study of Argentina that was done by a woman who is now at U4 in Bergen, Norway, showing that the most important institutions, the most effective institutions in Argentina at the time were little political networks, so state governors, of military officers, of corporate owners, and they made decisions, and it wasn't, they could do well whether things were being privatized or not. In the end, privatization might only cut corruption in a definitional sense by helping the bad guys get what they want without having to engage in the old kinds of law breaking, just to go ahead and take what they want more or less directly. So privatization is something not to be relied upon just in itself. Now, privatization, that term comes from Marshall Goldman, who used it in reference to Russia in the early years of this century, and it basically means that the strong men move in, the big the big figures and their allies and clients move in and start taking with both hands. It's an extreme scenario, to be sure, but we may be seeing some of it already in the international economy, the shadow and offshoring economies. And, again, we should be cautious about denigrating government. We should be cautious about exalting the the markets and the private sector. And I say that not to take an ideological stand, but rather a pragmatic one, I would hope, heeding the work of people like Michael Sandel. His excellent book, What Money Can't Buy, is reading that I always had my students do. They didn't, at first they didn't like it, but they got a great deal out of it. We need to be suspicious of populist appeals. More to come on that in a moment. With the privatization of everything, that's where we see the extended effects of what Lessig calls institutional corruption, or Dennis Thompson does as well. Corruption that is built into and takes advantage of laws and institutions. It also spills over into worries about money's influence over elections. We have Sheldon Adelson in the United States, whose concern is partly legalizing casinos or deregulating casinos, and it is partly foreign policy, saying that he'll put $100 million US into various campaigns. And then we have Michael Bloomberg on the left, or the Democratic side anyway, saying he'll put in $100 million of his own into Florida. That's not balance. I mean, that's that could be a sign of the privatization of the political system. Somewhere in here I had populism. No, populists oh, here they are, populist ascendant. I want to come back to that because we know that many of those populists are charlatans. The phrase, the name Donald John Trump comes to mind. There's Bolsonaro in Brazil and Orban in Hungary and so forth. But I want to suggest that the followers of the populists, even if they are being misled, even if the populists are taking advantage of them, and they are, they're saying something important to us, and that is that in a democracy or a would-be democracy or a democratizing system, even just in terms of expectations, Mark Warren made the point that the essence of corruption is the duplicitous exclusion of citizens from decisions and processes affecting their lives. Michael Sandel makes this point as well, that people get crowded out. They feel crowded out. They don't have a say. They feel they count for nothing. And that sense is widespread and very powerful, and of course is all too subject to manipulation and demagoguery. Anti-corruption reformers need to get political. They need to reclaim that issue. They need to address that feeling of being left out. And really, if we think about it, in some respects, what we're doing in trying to take on corruption is to challenge exactly that sort of exclusion, to reopen the system, to bring people either back in or in for the first time to decisions that affect their lives and in which they have a right to take part. A final sort of scenario, maybe this is the most idealistic of all, but maybe something like justice. Maybe that's a possible outcome. That corruption, if we think about it, and this is the argument that Scott Fritzen and I make in this short book that's coming out at the end of the year. Corruption isn't just misbehavior. It isn't just institutional process problems. Fundamentally, it's a symptom of imbalances of power. It's a symptom of imbalances of power that allow the few to exploit the many, or the few to disregard and exclude the many, to borrow from Warren's way of putting it. And I think a lot of reforms will accomplish relatively little until we address those underlying imbalances. Now that is a real, that's a tough sell within the reform industry because it has largely been apolitical. For several reasons. Many of the major organizations are barred by their terms of reference from political interventions, and within a certain limits, that's a good thing. But that has driven a political frame of reference out of the industry. Often, politics has been seen as the problem, not as a potential solution. That we have to separate politics from government. This being an old American shibboleth from way back. We argue in the book that the reformers need to be much more political. They need to address those imbalances of power, and they need to do so not with dedicated, quote unquote, civil society anti-corruption organizations. I mean, I was involved in Ukraine in a group of anti-corruption clubs, and I mean, it was great and it was fun work. And when the money from the U.S. AID agency ran out, so did the anti-corruption clubs, because people had to put food on the table somehow. Instead, linking reform to the problems people have and working in a long-term and indirect way to enable people to object to government mistreatment for their own reasons with respect to their own problems. The quality of schools in their neighborhood, whether the roads ever really get built, police mistreatment, the many ways. People will tell us what those problems are. They're telling us all the time. Linking reform to doing things about those problems, to gathering data, benchmarking them about how well government is performing, and seeing if we can improve that performance. I've got a long-term scheme of mine, or some people might call it my hobby horse, about indicators and benchmarks of government performance. That's just one example of how such activities could carry on. And in that way, I often get asked, let's say we do succeed in improving government. how much of that is a result of controlling corruption, and how much of that is a result of other kinds of changes? Well, speaking as a scholar, that's a fascinating question. Speaking as a reformer, I don't care. That if we can move in that direction, if we can show that we are improving the responsiveness, the quality of government, the services it provides, the openness, the fairness and justice of government activities, we're squeezing corruption out of the system in the process of perhaps solving other problems. And historically, that's how, corruption issues in some of the better governed societies today came onto the agenda. How are we going to get government to treat us better? Well, it isn't a 5-point and a 5-point governance plan. It's, let's get political, let's organize, let's draw some lines in the sand. Frederick Douglass said it better than anyone else in 1857. I think he was in Rochester, New York at the time. His power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. And that, I think, has to be the foundation of any successful anti-corruption effort. It doesn't mean we stop working on compliance. It doesn't mean we stop trying to improve institutional procedures, or that we stop enforcement and the like, but it means that we need to ensure there is strong demand that those things do get done. Just to conclude, basically I think the key is political. The key involves contention and being open to contention, helping citizens confront government mistreatment, corruption politically, based on their own interests, based on the things that matter to them, helping enhance people's capacity for autonomy and advocacy. I mean, it could very well be that the best, sort of place to start in terms of fighting corruption might be literacy programs, might be enhancing the quality of education. As a matter of fact, Eric Uslander has this fascinating book that he came out with, I think, about 3 years ago, showing that a strong predictor of the quality of corruption control in countries today is the openness and availability of mass education back in 1870. Now, I mean, we can't go back to dial the clock back to 1870, but what it suggests is that enabling people, giving people the tools, means that they'll have a chance to do a lot of the anti-corruption work themselves for their own reasons. Assessing the quality of services, indicators, and benchmarks, is possibly a way to give credit to effective leaders and managers, rather than coming in and saying, you people really need to improve your institutions. Show that it can be done. Show that reform is producing improvements, can produce improvements. Show that better government is possible, and that it has its rewards for the leaders and the managers who produce it. This is a long-term approach. It is often an indirect approach. It's one that offers, with respect to funding agencies and so forth, it offers many fewer opportunities to claim credit, and because we're not talking about 36-month projects or something like this. Pardon me. Very indirect links between reform and the results that we seek, but it mirrors the historical process in some of today's better governed societies, where people brought official power within boundaries, within restrictions, in the course of fighting over deeper underlying issues. Who is to govern whom, by what right, with what means, within what limits. And I think it shows finally the importance of fighting corruption with citizens and with on their terms, with their interests in mind, rather than trying to do it for them, rather certainly trying to claim credit for success that we have so far tended not to have. I think I have probably run well over my limit here, so I will back off and stop, and I will say thank you and put up my email address, and perhaps hope that we'll have a few comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. If you could just stop sharing your screen, that would be great.
Yeah.
I'm going to pass over
Nobody
to
wants
Adam
to
Graycar
screen it.
for a few comments and a bit of a wrap up. In the meantime, if anybody's got questions for Michael, you can please type them into the Q&A session, and we will get to those after Adam's spoken. Thanks very much.
Okay, here I am. I don't think I have any video at the moment. I think it's been turned off and the screen is there. Okay, here we are. Thank you very much, Michael. And I think you've laid out some really interesting challenges. Working towards the future can be a very, very difficult thing. As one wit once said, the future ain't what it used to be. And if we thought 12 months ago about plotting the future we have today, we wouldn't be anywhere near where we are. So we've got to look at a dynamic situation. And as you pointed out, Michael, the whole process of corruption is evolving very significantly. There are just 3 points I wanted to make. First of all, in 2005, Michael wrote what I think is still the most influential book in the field, Syndromes of Corruption, that showed that corruption varies enormously depending on political styles and political cultures, from major kleptocracy to access and influence. And the corollary of that is that interventions vary as well. But as he pointed out today, so much corruption is embedded in legal processes. So, understanding the syndromes is very important to look forward for the next many years. The second point is that rich country corruption really is different to poor country corruption. And are we really talking about 2 separate beasts? Do we focus on processes and ethics in rich countries to make sure that you don't get bagfuls of cash and that people follow processes? And do we focus on political stability in poor countries? And there are a couple of ways, interestingly, of looking at that. Bob Klitgaard put up his famous formula saying corruption equals monopoly plus discretion minus accountability. And this is sort of the base of principal agent corruption. But Paul Preston, writing in a totally different context about the Spanish Civil War, put up a different formula. He said corruption plus political incompetence, when we get both of those, equals social division. And that's the big question. And that's where Michael was coming from when he was talking about political inequality. And so that gets on to the third point, and that is the solution. Is the solution a political solution? And that raises the question of whether the nation state is the correct unit to use to combat corruption. First of all, is it the right unit of analysis? As I've often said, it doesn't really help our analysis a lot to say that Denmark is less corrupt than Zimbabwe, for example. But might we, want to look at societies that are more or less unequal, societies in which people feel less part of it or more part of it? And then it gets back to how do you fight corruption? And as Michael pointed out at the end, very often you don't fight corruption by fighting corruption. You do it by increasing literacy, all the things that he went through about building better social cohesion. But there are also significant issues in looking at sectors. Sometimes we can make significant gains by looking at corruption in the mining sector, in the healthcare sector, in the fisheries sector, in the education sector. They come about in different ways. So, understanding the nature of the issue is every bit as important in looking at means of countering it and means of intervention. Michael looked forward to 2050. Transparency International has recently put out a very nice landscape and scenario setting issue looking at 2030. And they bring in things, like climate change, demographic shifts, populism, fragility of states, wealth inequality, technological changes. All these things are going to impact on how people work stuff out. And the final point, it's not really a question, is you've always got a situation, you've always had a situation where there's somebody on the make. So dealing with that person on the make is one set of issues. Dealing with the broad political culture is another set of issues. And I just want to throw those into the discussion. So thanks for that, Adam.
Okay, thanks, Adam. We do have a couple of questions. So we're going to start with giving the mic access to Paul Hatchcroft, who's got a question, and followed by Leslie Holmes.
Yes, thanks very much, Adam. And Michael, really appreciate your insights today. Delighted to meet you, at least virtually, after benefiting from your insights for so many years, I'd say even decades. I wanted to pick up on your comments about the impact of populism, and particularly in the US context, all of the rhetoric on the deep state, which I think is such a insidious new assault on the state in general, and one that has not, I think, been effectively countered. The way in which the rhetoric of deep state can be used to try to shut people down when they are interested in trying to protect the wide range of anti-corruption reforms that have been in place, because this is an administration that's gone after the Hatch Act, the inspectors general that are posted around different bureaucracies, campaign finance reform. I mean, a lot of very important progressive anti-corruption reforms that date back to the late 19th century. So if there is a rhetorical assault on the state by talking about deep state, it seems like we need to very effectively talk about the dangers of a shallow state and all it does to bring about the patterns of elite capture that we see under the Trump administration. So what do you make of this deep state rhetoric, and how might you see it best be countered? And this is, I'm speaking specifically within the US context here, because I don't see that kind of rhetoric taking hold, having the kind of traction it has in the US in other populist regimes to nearly the same extent.
Yes. Here. Yeah, excellent comments, and I wanted to respond to Adam's remark about the past and the future. In the sense, my favorite quotation about the future is from the late Paul Quisenberry, who was a baseball pitcher, and he said that I have seen the future, and it's very much like the present, only longer. I don't know that that's true anymore, actually, because things are moving so fast and in such negative directions in so many ways. Very kind words from Adam about the syndrome system. It needs to be improved. I mean, it needs to be revisited, and I have done that in a couple of ways. My thought has been that maybe we can be talking about 6 syndromes instead of 4, and only 2 of them might be mine, but that we can, one way or another, get off the one-dimensional sort of map of the world, and I certainly hope that would be the case. And the more we get off that one-dimensional view, the more we will see that social divisions, the more we will see that rich country versus poor country corruption are not just variations on the same thing. An excellent comment too about whether the nation state is the best sort of unit of analysis. I remember Clifford Geertz, saying at one point, we talk about corruption as though it were a national trait. And in many ways we do, you know, sort of, as Adam says, Denmark is this, Russia is that, New Zealand is that. And that's silly. If we started out to make those claims as a positive assertion, we would see the problems right off. Pardon me. But you know, looking at sectors, well, you know, if we look at sectors, then we begin to put our analysis kind of in the same ballpark in which the corrupt actors are acting. The mining sector, not to mention any names, but those who are exploiting the mining sector. You know, they are also, in a sense, simplifying some of our analysis, I think, or analytical challenges in a way that we need and we must take advantage of. So, you know, there we have a real opportunity. I have, you know, I want to congratulate Paul Hutchcroft on his work, because I have benefited from his work for so long. And we get to the deep state. You know, one of the other things that occurred to me is that Donald Trump right now is attacking what is, in historical terms, the deepest part of our state, which is the postal system, as mundane as that may seem. You know, he's got his fingers around the throat of the electoral process, potentially. If we haven't got the state, what have we got? If we haven't got the state as a way to check, to moderate, to hold accountable, you know, what have we got? You know, we have this sort of shallow, hollowed out state that has the facade, but not much of anything else. And I think one reason why that deep state appeal is so well, it's so powerful in some respects and so unsettling in others, goes back to Mark Warren's point about exclusion, that if people have felt excluded from the state, that they don't have a voice, that they don't have any comprehension, that they don't know what's going on, that then veiled and sinister references to the deep state are all the more, you know, easy to sell and all the more threatening to invoke. And so, you know, yes, we have, in a sense, to use somebody's old phrase from about 30 years ago, we've got to bring the state back in, but bring it in ways that relate to people's lives, and not just to a technocratic sort of conception of good governance. You know, Paul has raised an absolutely critical point here, and it touches upon the populism issue. It touches upon the vitality of electoral and economic accountability and so forth. And you know, we can and should talk about that for hours on end. But I would just say that we're seeing an extended consequence of the exclusion that Warren has brought to our attention.
Okay, thanks, Michael. We'll go to Leslie Holmes now, who has another question.
Thank you so much. As I expected, it was a terrific presentation. Like Paul, I've been a long admirer of your work. 3 quick questions. Firstly, in terms of bringing the state back in many ways, COVID-19 has brought the state back in. And I wonder if you think that this is a short-term or a long-term phenomenon, and if so, whichever way you think it's going, what are the implications for anti-corruption? Secondly, you didn't mention organised crime, and I'm a great believer in looking at links between organised crime and corruption. We're seeing the increasing intervention of organised crime in the legal economy. At the moment, because of COVID-19, we think that they're getting increasingly involved in pharmaceuticals, for instance. So you and I will both know the expression plumber or plata, I think it's that way around, silver or lead. It's not always, corruption is not always a matter of personal interest and gain. It can also be threats. And what future do you see there if organised crime is on the rise? And you mentioned technology, and organised crime always seems to be one technological step ahead of the authorities. Is that really something to worry us? And finally, these actually are rather bigger questions that I realised when I jotted them down. The relationship between democracy and particularly the rule of law. Is our respect for democracy and particularly of the rule of law, is that hindering us in our bid to reduce corruption? I hope that's clear. You're looking a bit as if you don't understand that question. Giving too many rights to people to avoid. I mean, you and I both, and all of us at this webinar know that proving corruption is extremely difficult. And I just wonder sometimes whether we tie our hands. It's not that I've got any solution to that, but I just wonder if you do agree there's a problem there. Thank you.
Oh, excellent questions. I mean, COVID-19, it raises the question for me, is there a state to bring back in? Is there a state at least that can do and be able to do what we expect it to do? I mean, because in the case of the United States, very few agencies were held in higher esteem at the beginning of the year than the Centers for Disease Control, and it's a shell of itself in terms of popular perception, in terms of political infiltration, and so forth. That doesn't mean keeping politics separate from government, but it means keeping politics accountable in political ways to broader constituencies, and not just those who want to manipulate government for their own purposes. Yes, I mean, COVID-19 has created an atmosphere of disorganization, chaos, in some cases fear, and organized crime has found it that much easier to move in as a consequence, to claim impunity in the midst of chaos. They know what they want, they know how to get it at a time when very few others in government seem to, very few others, especially those in government, let me say, seem to even have a clear sense of what their mission is anymore. Democracy and the rule of law, yes. And a focus only on enforcement, only on legality, only on prevention invites that kind of hindrance of tying our hands. And, here I'm going to say something that's really open to being misunderstood because, it's a long time finding or frequent finding in statistical work that the security of property rights is a correlative low levels of corruption. But at the same time, where you have institutional corruption, where you have corruption taking advantage of the laws and institutions rather than simply defying them or undermining them, quite often nasty guys can hide behind property rights, can hide behind the sort of rule of law guarantees that they have, and especially in a time when we have celebrated the private sector by going private. Can keep themselves that much less accountable. Our Foreign Corrupt Practices Act finally began to be enforced in the early 2000s, a mere 30 years almost after it was enacted, and they began to put pressure on corporations because of their political bribery and political spending. Well, two problems there. One was that the U.S. tended to go after corporations based elsewhere rather than those domestically who were reliable campaign contributors. But the other thing was that when a corporation started catching heat, it would simply go private. It would delist itself from the public equity markets, and the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was just, therefore a kind of a little curiosity that they didn't have to worry about. So in some senses, some of those rule of law principles do tie our hands, and that's an excellent question. I want to think a lot more about that because it really sets up some contradictions in ways that I hadn't, that had not really occurred to me. So, I thank you very much.
Okay, well, look, this was the last question. I'll come in and do a quick little bit of a wrap up. It's very hard to wrap everything up, and I'd like to certainly thank our participants and thank Paul and Les for were questions that they've raised. What you've done, Michael, is you've opened our eyes to some very, very keen and important issues. And one of it is drawing a boundary around what it is. You know, when people are corruption scholars, they study corruption. They don't study literacy, they don't study climate change and so on. And the question then is, you know, how do you, when do you cross the boundary? And this is an interesting thing in the academic world, on the one hand, where it's often difficult to get stuff published on corruption because it's not economics enough, it's not political science enough, it's not philosophy enough, and I won't get into those sorts of journals. But nevertheless, it defines the issue that we're dealing with. And what we're dealing with is really people that are deviating from norms of various sorts, and those norms change over time. And as we look to the future, we'll see the changes in those norms. And so what was acceptable behaviour a decade ago, a generation ago, is not so today. And it may be in the future, it may not be in the future. And a lot of that, you know, the Me Too movement is a very classic example of that. You know, a lot of men don't understand why they're pariahs now because they do what other men have done for decades. And so, but then the same in the corruption business. But we've moved a long way. When I talk to people, they say, well, what do you work on? I say, I work on corruption. Oh, they said, what a waste of time. You know, we've always had corruption. We're always going to have it. There's not much you can do. You know, you're just wasting your time. But if we start to look at some very specific examples, we can see that progress has been made. And they're very, very small steps of progress. You know, anti-corruption agencies have changed the way a lot of public servants behave. In the state of Queensland, in Australia, Michael, you know, a generation ago, the police were run by a bunch of crooks, and you had to be a crook to get promoted in the police. You know, that is simply not so today. But it doesn't mean that we've solved all our corruption problems. You know, minor issues are resolved, and they make a lot of difference to people. They make a lot of difference to people. But on the other hand, the big picture questions of where we go, the purchase of decisions, the purchase of elections, even in a democratic process, undermines the well-being of the community. And where we're really going is not just that some individual makes a bit more money than they should because they've manipulated a process, but it's about the whole of our social cohesion. It's about how we respond to things like populism. It's about the way in which we have an inclusive culture, and corruption is one part of all of that. Now, we could you know, spend a long time discussing all of these things, and I know you've been doing it for many years. Your book, your earlier books, each one builds onto each of the others. But it reminds me of a comment that Henry Kissinger once made when he was at the peak of his powers. And his comment was something like, every time you solve a difficult problem, that buys you a ticket or an entry point to the next difficult problem. And so one thing, corruption studies, they ain't going to go away. They'll be, you know, sliced and diced in different ways, but they ain't going to go away. And so with those comments, I'll hand back to Adam Masters, and you know, Adam, you can take us out then.
Okay, thanks, Adam, and thank you so much, Michael, for your time. I understand that there's a glass of wine waiting for you, and it's well deserved. And I'd like to thank all the participants who've come along to listen to Michael as well. We will be arranging more of these webinars, and hopefully you can join us in the future. So thank you very much, everyone.